Tony Gerdeman from the Ozone joining us to talk Ohio State football as the Buckeyes prepare for their Cotton Bowl Classic game against USC. Of course, riding a 7-game losing streak all-time to USC, going back to the 1974 Rose Bowl. So, Tony, before we focus on the matchup here, your thoughts about the Ohio State-Alabama comparison, what you thought the committee did versus what you thought should have happened, and because they obviously both had their arguments and they were very different arguments.
Yeah, and I think this year there were 3 deserving teams and maybe not any more than that. And so then you have to compare Ohio State and Alabama. And when the committee says that it was close between Ohio State, Alabama, and a couple of other teams in there, and then you see Ohio State beat the number 4 Wisconsin team and not get that bid, you have to feel kind of duped by the committee that you can't really believe what they're saying, because obviously they weren't that close, because Alabama still got the nod despite losing their way in. And what I always go back to then is that the Iowa game. You can't lose like that on the road and expect to maybe get the benefit of the doubt. And I don't ever see Nick Saban's Alabama team losing like that. So when Alabama gets that spot that Ohio State wanted, I don't have a huge complaint, or I don't have an argument, I would say. What my problem would be is just the way the committee framed it before the Big Ten Championship, and then the way they framed it after the Big Ten Championship. And they really, I think I tweeted the day after, like, it was this Big Ten Championship game was as meaningless as all of the basketball Big Ten Championship games, because the brackets are already announced before that, are already put together before that game, and they don't even take it into consideration. And it's pretty clear that that same thing happened this time. I don't know if Ohio State needed another 59-0 win. Maybe that would have changed things. But it was clear that Alabama fans were rooting for Ohio State. The committee was rooting for Ohio State. And I think those two groups were rooting for Ohio State just as much as Buckeye fans were, because once Ohio State won, then the committee could do what they wanted with Alabama. And, because they would have had to put Wisconsin in. And obviously, they did not want to do that. And so I think they got their way with the win by Ohio State.
The Big Ten Championship game turned out to be just as meaningless as the Iron Bowl, which actually turned out to be counterproductive, because Alabama was not forced to play one of the top 5 teams in the country and risk its spot in the college football playoff. And then the team that was positioned to go to the college football playoff had to play another game, Auburn, and they, of course, lost that game and got knocked out of the college football playoff. So, if anything, I will be tempted to point out to SEC fans and those fans of Alabama and Auburn in particular that their game's not quite as important as they think it is, especially when it's actually counterproductive to the team that wins and benefits the team that loses, at least here in 2017. So I'm not going to go through all the obvious metrics and the comparisons that we've both made, I'm sure, on a number of platforms back and forth, except for one thing that drives me nuts is that, okay, this Iowa game points out one metric that the committee uses is not just to evaluate the wins and losses based on the result of the game, but in the ugliness of the loss or the dominance of the win. So this obviously turned out for Ohio State's detriment, getting blasted by 31 points against Iowa. But if you take out Ohio State's best 2 wins, Penn State and Wisconsin, go to its 3rd best win, Michigan State, which is comparable to Alabama's best win against LSU or Mississippi State, most likely LSU, because Mississippi State dropped its last game without its quarterback, Nick Fitzgerald. Alabama beats Mississippi State in the last minute of the game, a game that they were being outplayed most of the game. They beat LSU. Yes, they were decidedly the better team, but it was a 4th quarter game, 24-10. It was a 1-score game. 4th quarter, they win by 2 scores. Okay, LSU, Michigan State. If you're going to discredit Ohio State for the awful loss in terms of point differential against Iowa, then you need to at least recognize and give them credit for the Michigan State win 35-3 at half, could have named their score 48-3 final. So a dominant win against a quality opponent versus just barely beating or decidedly, but only winning a decent performance against an LSU team that's comparable to Michigan State. That I don't know was taken into consideration with the same weight, or maybe even any weight. Doesn't from the rhetoric out there, it doesn't seem like it was given any weight versus what the Iowa game was given.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then also when the committee that week leading up puts Fresno State in the top 25, that was a huge red flag. And that maybe was Alabama's third best win. And you look at Ohio State, their least important win was UNLV, maybe. UNLV beat Fresno State this year. So there's a very an Army beat Navy. Army had a really good year this year. Ohio State beat them. So there's the resume, and it's just like that loss to Iowa trumped all of it. It's like you can have, like in the real world, you can have this awesome resume, but if you checked yes next to have you ever been arrested for a felony, it doesn't matter what the rest of it says. And I think maybe the Iowa loss was felonious.
That is a tremendous analogy right there, because that's pretty much what it came down to right there. And you mentioned some of the lesser wins for Ohio State that they were actually somewhat made fun of at some point, in terms of saying, okay, well, we saw them against Oklahoma, and then until they didn't play a decent team, Penn State, between those games, it was like, what have they done? Well, those couple teams there turned out to be pretty good. And then I heard a lot about Alabama dominance. Well, that dominance was against really bad teams in the SEC, and that's what you're supposed to do. Well, that's what Ohio State did against Maryland, Nebraska, Rutgers, Illinois. They completely annihilated those teams as well. I didn't see the dominance being out of kilter or not analogous as well. So
yeah, and I'll say one other thing. When the committee says that they wipe everything clean each week, and that they don't look back at last year or whatever, they don't look at conferences, given the fact that they basically lied about Alabama and Ohio State being close, you really can't take anything they say as truth. So I also think the loss to Clemson last year for Ohio State hurt them, because obviously the committee is going to look back on that as well. And they look at the past games between Alabama and Clemson, and obviously those were closer, more entertaining, and just the better product. So I think that loss, that 31-0 loss, hurt last year as well, because I don't believe the committee when they say they wipe everything clean each week. They don't look back at last year, because they've shown that they lie about certain things. So you can't really believe much of anything they would say in their rules and regulations.
They didn't want to pit Ohio State against Clemson, not necessarily thinking Ohio State was going to get destroyed again, but the possibility that it would happen again. They would look just awful in that situation.
And if Clemson blows Alabama out, that's just good television.
Yes, I think for Ohio State fans at this point, it would be good television. All right, Tony Gerdeman joining us from the Ozone. Please join him there for the best in Ohio State football as the Buckeyes prepare, I should say, for the USC Trojans.